Welcome, everybody. My name is Victoria Wolcott. I am the director of the Gender Institute and professor of the Department of History here at the University at Buffalo. Welcome and for joining us. Thank you so much for joining us on this Friday afternoon. And before I begin, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land upon which the University at Buffalo operates, which is the territory of the Seneca Nation, a member of the Haudenosaunee Six Nations Confederacy. Today, this region is still the home to the Haudenosaunee people, and we are grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and share ideas in this territory. I'm so delighted to be hosting this event today. This is part of our New Books, New Feminist Direction series here at the Gender Institute at the University at Buffalo. So welcome both people in the UB Buffalo community, but we also have people in Europe and elsewhere in the United States joining us. So thank you to all of you for coming and joining us today. I'm going to be introducing our speakers today, and then I'll be turning things over to them. Meghana Joshi will be first talking a bit about the book and kind of giving a summary, and then we hear a reply from Annika Koenig to her book project. So let me start by introducing Meghana. Meghana Joshi earned her PhD in cultural anthropology from Rutgers University in 2017. Her dissertation research examined issues of childlessness, stigma, and medical treatment in urban slums in Mumbai, and on maternal and community health in the rural Himalayas. After a brief stint at Central Washington University, she has been employed as teaching assistant professor in the anthropology department here at UB since 2018. Her book on gendered reproduction, fertility anxieties, intensive parenting, and childlessness is based on research in Berlin, Germany, and this is, of course, what she'll be talking about today. She teaches on medical anthropology, culture and reproduction, men and masculinities, and ethnographic research. Her newly developing research interests include anthropology of loneliness and emergent forms of care. And in response to her project will be Annika Koenig, who's joining us from Germany. So we're particularly grateful for her for doing that. It's the end of her workday today. She is a visiting professor at the Institute for Social and Cultural Anthropology at the Universität Berlin. Her work focuses on reproduction, especially transnational surrogacy, genetic testing, kinship, care, and gender. She also has worked extensively on violence, the senses, and the body. Her recent work investigates the effects of major crises like the COVID pandemic or the war in Ukraine on the global fertility industry and the gender health gap in Germany, with a particular focus on endometriosis. Her work has appeared, among others, in the Medical Anthropology Journal, Biosocieties, New Genetics and Society, and Social Anthropology. And we will have time also for some Q&A after the presentations. So with that, I'll turn it over to Meghana.
Thank you so much, Victoria. I want to start here by thanking the Gender Institute, especially you, Victoria, for inviting me. I also wanted to say thank you to Megan and Surabhi for organizing everything and their support. And of course, Annika, thank you for joining at the end of your workday. I look forward to hearing what you have to say about the book. And thank you, everybody else who's here. I can't see them, but I'm so glad. Can you hear me?
We can now.
All right. Did you hear what I said before this?
Mostly.
Okay. I was just saying thank you to everybody, Victoria, Megan, and Surabhi for your support, Annika for joining us, and for the audience. I look forward to hearing what you all have to say. I hate children. Well, it's not really the children as much as the Kinderwagen Mafia. I've translated that as stroller mafia. These mothers are a menace on the street. Have you seen how proudly they strut around pushing those bulky 1,000 euro strollers? There's an aggression and entitlement about reproducing that is quite uncharacteristic of the Berlin I knew. Vera, a West Berliner and an entrepreneur in her early 40s, uttered these words to me in the summer of 2012 during my second week of long-term fieldwork in Berlin, Germany. I remember feeling shocked and confused, but also a growing curious excitement upon hearing Vera. What did it mean to talk about aggressive mothers and strollers they pushed? What was new, as Vera said, about this aggression and entitlement? And why did she not associate it with the Berlin she knew? Now, over the course of field work, strollers, as one of the many material and symbolic manifestations of Berliners' relation to reproduction, appeared conspicuously in multiple idioms, life histories, spaces, and sentiments. I had to move out of that apartment into this new one to avoid tripping over the strollers lying around common areas, one of my neighbors told me. I don't ride my bicycle on the same side of the street as an oncoming stroller. I don't want to be accused of putting anyone's child in danger. A staff member at a daycare center scoffed. Germany apparently wants to create a kinderfreundliche Gesellschaft, a child-friendly society. It's a lost cause. Often you are asked to control your child's screaming or simply met with blank stares, shared Anna, a mother of two, who told me that she had recently been asked to hurry up a little as she was trying to push the stroller with her infant in it up a flight of stairs slick with winter ice. My ethnographic fieldwork started in the summers of 2010 and 11, followed by a year-long stay in 2012 and from 2012 to 2013. And of course, over the last decade, I've continued conversations via emails, phone, and Skype. And I also made a summer visit in 2023 before this book came out. This research on gendered reproduction, parenting, and childlessness in Germany was driven by several motivations. I'm born and raised in India, and I started my PhD in 2009 in the US in anthropology. I did not want to reinforce assumptions, if I may call it that, in my discipline, that South Asians go back to South Asia to do their fieldwork. I had previously done research in India on infertility in Mumbai, mainly in shanty towns, and access to medical treatment here was limited. And the burdens and stigma of what scholars call barrenness among plenty are often severe. Now, Germany, on the other hand, with consistent low fertility over decades, provided a contrasting demographic and social context. I don't claim that all of India is familiar with it or that any place outside India is always strange, but being a cultural outsider in Germany was crucial for forming particular connections, asking specific questions, and basically really crucial for knowledge production. Being out of place and a novice to German norms, I was also in the presence of curious Berliners eager to explain. So I inquired into adult-child interactions, or why Berliners characterized West German policy as kinderunfreundlich, or child unfriendly, what it meant to have citizens file a complaint against a neighborhood playground that was, I quote, zu schön, zu groß, zu laut, which is too beautiful, too big, too loud. I asked about what fathers on paternity leave did and how they cared for their children, and I listened intently as many Berliners talked about national demographic anxieties, assisted reproduction, aggressive mothers, intolerable children, bare feet playgrounds, and obnoxiously big strollers. I start with strollers here today, and I say more about other things soon enough, because strollers on city streets, buses, in playgrounds, and cafes were just about as odd to me as the scorn that these objects aroused. I did not associate moving infants with strollers. In India, generally, children who can't walk are carried. Mothers in India, if not working, spend most of their time at home or in the neighborhood taking care of their children. And mobility might be restricted depending upon how far they could go or where they can go with their children in tow. Also, try pushing a stroller on Mumbai streets with a population of over 20 million, or on any of India's crowded streets for that matter. In Berlin, on the other hand, I saw mothers, fathers, and others with strollers everywhere. Of course, these figures drew my attention because I was doing research on them, but irrespective of that, they were hard to miss. Subways, streets, buses, cafes, playgrounds, and stores would sometimes become sites for contestation, with the stroller's motion restricted in certain places and enabled in others. I observed how they were pushed through cafe doors and in some cases prevented to enter specific buildings, how they earned stares in subways, were less tolerated than dogs in public, were parked in front of children's cafes, yes, children's cafes, or pushed into sandpits on playgrounds, and in several neighborhoods across Berlin, set on fire. So this is just one of the many newspaper articles I came across while I was doing my fieldwork. This is a 2013 report where a 29-year-old man was sentenced to 5 years in prison because he set about, many strollers in residential buildings on fire. And the lawyer explained that, this has something to do with envy and resentment against people with more means. Here you have a cafe. I actually interviewed a lot of people in this cafe. I held my interviews in this cafe. Not only does it have a sign that prevents strollers from entry, but it actually has an obstruction in front in case people decide to ignore the sign. Nicole, a university professor who lived in Berlin before having a child, recalled visiting the cafe and walking in later with her 4-year-old. She said to me, "I was constantly asking my son to be quiet, even though he wasn't really that loud. I felt the urge to pretend to be single and childless. It is like Berlin doesn't allow you to be a parent." On the other hand, you have this cafe, which in all the newspaper reports and also after talking to the cafe owners, I learned that this was their attempt at being child-friendly. So they had these two separate sections. As you can see, one side, parents with strollers could come in, and the other side was for adults without children and without strollers. Also, this separate section had this sign on its door. So this is this door that opens into this section where no strollers are allowed. And this little sign with the white background reads, "Neu für Eltern ohne Kinder," which basically means for Eltern without children. And there's no word Eltern in the German language as it's written there. It has no meaning, but the way it's pronounced, it's exactly like the German word Eltern with an E, which means parents. Alt, A-L-T, on the other hand, means old. And here, I venture a guess, it could mean that whether or not you have children, you are an adult. I don't know. I don't quite recall having a conversation with the cafe owner about that sign. So as you can see, strollers were a conspicuous material appendage that defined the encounter between various social groups. They signified class and regional distinctions, as well as for many Berliners, stood in for transformations in the meaningfulness of biological and social reproduction. In this book, I illustrate these transformations and emergent social divisions through the lens of what I call conspicuous reproduction. This refers to discourses and practices that make reproduction explicit in public consciousness and also for social contemplation and consumption. Conspicuousness is associated, of course, with the material presence of strollers and children, but more importantly, it is this perception of presence in an exaggerated value placed on the child and the display of child-centered ideas and concerns. It signifies the palpable discourse on fertility anxieties and state policies that tend towards selective pronatalism. I argue that in its material and symbolic conspicuousness, German reproduction signals transformations in reproductive regimes in contemporary Berlin that privilege particular forms of biological families, marginalize non-reproductive concerns, and disregard non-biological intimacies. Conceptually, conspicuousness here signals a form of stratified reproduction where childbearing and rearing are differentially experienced, valued, and rewarded. Additionally, it also allows for a broader understanding of reproduction, not as a series of events, like the event of pregnancy or the event of a miscarriage, but as a biological and social process that integrates having as well as not having children. Also, the book tells stories of divergent actors who came of age around the fall of the Berlin Wall. They call themselves the Wende generation, Wende referring to reunification. And this age cohort and their generational stories were central to understanding reproductive transformations in my field site. I can explain that a little bit later if we have time. I compare reproductive trajectories across men and women, experiences of both fatherhood and male infertility, and intensive parenting, specifically mothering, and women without children. I do this to illustrate a range of perspectives and historically and culturally specific practices and categories. I show how, in a low fertility Germany, reproduction emerges as a form of inclusion exclusion and segregates Berliners into groups and allegiances. These divisions appear across parenting ideologies and practices, and also across parent and non-parent groups, but also across or between Berliners and those designated as outsiders, between East and West Germans, etc., affecting wider solidarity, often pitting people against each other and arousing resentments. On the other hand, for some of my interlocutors, reproduction gone, quote unquote, awry, allows for diverse forms of intimacies and sense of belonging. So while in Berlin, I often heard about how the city had transformed itself after reunification. And one of the ways in which people told me about these transformations is how much investment had been made in renovating older buildings or real estate projects, and how that had contributed to attracting West Germans from wealthier states to Berlin, both for jobs as well as to have children. In the last 15 years or so, many neighborhoods that initially skirted the wall during the Cold War have become now central to the city and have transformed into what my interlocutors call a Kinderinsel, which is a children's island, displacing former residents and displacing, according to many Berliners, the quote-unquote original charm of the city. Simultaneously, in the years since 2007, the German state has taken on qualitatively and quantitatively a bolder role in family matters to address low fertility. So just to mention a few of these interventions, fathers are now able to take extended leave after the birth of a child up to 3 years with about 67% of pay. There are some restrictions there, but most fathers can do this. Fathers' rights advocates also told me how, because of these interventions and government attention to these matters, their efforts have been recognized and valued and supported through public funding. So this is a community-based initiative that provides a range of support and resources to men who parent, men who are going to be fathers or have been separated from their partners and are fighting for custody, etc., all kinds of resources. And I also met a lot of men who were on paternity leave through this Papa Laden. Other than this, more money has been set aside also for infrastructure, such as constructing daycares or training personnel in daycares, also setting up these kinder cafes or children's cafes, and improving and constructing playgrounds, specifically these barefoot playgrounds. So here is, two of the rooms inside a particular kinder cafe, and then this is another one. And Richard, the 55-year-old, one of the employees at the Papa Laden, said to me, I run away from these kinder cafes. There's one practically in every part of the city now. The noise levels are staggering. It gives the children permission to be inconsiderate. Here is a sign that says barfuß or basically barfuß meaning bare feet. So it's designated as a bare feet playground. And I had many people who spoke to me about these playgrounds, talk to me about how impractical they were because you can't really, roam freely, grill, and you have to always be careful about not leaving stuff behind so it doesn't cut children's feet or hurt them in some way. These are just some images from some of these bare feet playgrounds. And then, of course, there is more. Dear neighbors, we are celebrating the 5th birthday of our daughter on Saturday. We apologize in advance for the impending noise and chaos. Of course, you can always ring our doorbell at any time if it gets too noisy, or unerträglich. And I kept the German word because I did want to just say that it's exactly translated as unbearable. So if the noise gets too unerträglich, please ring the bell and let us know. This was pasted to the common notice board in the apartment complex I lived in. And what seemed to me, coming from India, as an exaggerated consideration for one's neighbors became over the following year a central theme in my conversations with people. I observed how my interlocutors often desired quiet and asked for it in varying ways. In the subway, in a cafe, on walks from other adults, and definitely from adults minding children. In 2011, Berlin was the first German state to revise a section of its noise laws and declare that children's noise produced through play, laughter, and physical activity in specific places like kindergartens or daycare centers or playgrounds were not equivalent to industrial noise. This meant that citizens could no longer hinder the construction of playgrounds or daycares in residential locations. You needed special permission before that, before this law was passed. And they could not justify their actions by stating that the noise level were harmful for their health or peace of mind. Because children's noise, according to this new law, was now classified under the same category as church bells or harvest work, therefore must be tolerated. Children's cafes, playgrounds, strollers, and noise crossed over into adult, material, emotional, and acoustic living spaces, organizing German-German relations in the city. A schrecklich or terrible demand on citizens to accommodate children was palpable on the streets of Berlin. In my book, I draw upon literature on anthropology of childhood to further interpret some of these conspicuous appearances. Scholars have examined how in Euro-American societies, particularly since the 1980s, children have been perceived as most vulnerable to dangers and risks from the outside. Consequently, to keep dangers at bay, children have been locked into spaces, restricted in their mobility, hedged in, or domesticated, as the phrase goes. These spaces or nodules of child-centered urbanism operate on the logic of in the name of children, right? Or in the best interests of the children, or for the safety of the child. In my field site, I observed how these nodules, both materially and symbolically, often expanded and spilled into other spaces previously not committed to the ideology of in the name of children. The figure of the child and the imagination about what that figure was, and also the material presence of children on the streets, were hyper-visible through specific techniques of parenting. Here I draw upon literature on parenting cultures and argue that the middle-class Euro-American cultural script, recognized as proper parenting, is intensive and individualized, such that cooperation between parents and community members is often undermined. Parenting is, therefore cast as a source of and also solution to a whole range of problems. So parents are given this message that if you follow these norms and fulfill certain expectations, then you can positively or negatively affect the child. Therefore, not merely quote unquote deficient or deficit parents, but all parents need an army of professionals to guide them. Intensive parenting is, of course, gendered, with the burden of total motherhood as falling mostly on women. Intensive mothering, as summarized by Hayes, is, I quote, child-centered, expert-guided, emotionally absorbing, labor-intensive, and financially expensive, end quote. I just want to briefly mention that I also talk about in the book how, just as women's parenting practices engender these moral evaluations, and in my field site, expressed very often through negative stereotypes and idiomatic utterances, women are also marked as producing a Kultur der Kinderlosigkeit, or a culture of childlessness, and they were considered the primary drivers of low fertility. Consequently, demographic anxieties and intensive mothering interpolated the category of the childless woman. Men on paternity leave, on the other hand, experience an emergent sense of belonging as they engage in childcare. Aktive Vaterschaft, or active fatherhood, as an ideology and form of parenting is supposed to contribute to this desire to reproduce and is socially valued and lauded. Yet men seeking infertility treatments are excluded from these communities that are based on exchange of procreative experiences. Reproductive exclusions and inclusions are clearly stratified along gender norms of proper reproduction and good parenting. On a final note, just some reflections on implications for sociality here. This may be true for other low fertility European contexts in similar ways, but there is something particular to Berlin that I've recorded here. Again, I'm happy to talk more about that. For one, when having children and parenting becomes a valued means to occupy space and access social and political voice, other life trajectories are often devalued. As such, what matters to those who do not reproduce in desired ways, what their experiences are, what their losses are, become relatively inconspicuous. Furthermore, in this context of conspicuous reproduction, social divisions emerge along categorizations such as parent and non-parent, limiting possibilities of adult sociality, intimacy, and solidarity across life pathways. This impacts how adult-adult relations are organized in the city, primarily through child-centered frameworks that potentially ignore other forms of intimacies. When children attain a social and national value, when state policies nurture a child-friendly society, and when we act in favor of the children, we also simultaneously create and displace categories such as asocial, child-unfriendly, or unsafe. Conspicuous reproduction profiles parents as good or bad and imposes specific normative cultural scripts of parenting, which has further implications for the evaluation of non-German migrant reproductive practices. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Meghna. That was wonderful. I will turn things over to Annika now.
Can you hear me? Yeah, wonderful. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to, discuss your book. I'm so happy, I was given the opportunity, and when it arrived in the mail, the first thing that struck me was this picture on the front. And I don't know, for those of you who have never maybe been to Germany or who don't know Germany well, this is just like, when you look at it, you know straight away, this is Germany, and this is a German playground. And I don't even know why. Probably Meghna can explain why. Because as a German, I lack the distance probably. I've prepared a few comments to this book, and but I would also, I'm also really looking forward to, discussing this in more detail later. But I think I will just, start commenting a little bit on the book, which I enjoyed reading incredibly. I really enjoyed this book so much. I think it's a wonderful book, and I'm already thinking about how I can include it in my teaching, because I think it'll also be really interesting for, students in Germany to actually, read this kind of research. So, well, let me start with like some more like general impressions I got from the book. So one of the things I found like really, really interesting and helpful in general to think about reproduction in Germany and specifically in Berlin was really this idea, or this approach of conspicuous reproduction. That is something that I felt, is an approach that's extremely fruitful and helpful. And that what I liked about it is that it includes so many different perspectives on reproduction, including topics like pronatalism, gendered expectations of parenting, infertility, childlessness also as a choice. I don't know if that discussion is also happening in the US, but right now in Germany there's also this like big discussion about like whether it's childless or child-free also making this like big difference of whether it's by choice or whether it's sort of involuntary because it's like because of infertility and so on, but we can talk about that a bit later. But so that is what I like about this like approach, like conspicuous reproduction really is sort of, you know, it's a very good umbrella that covers you know, all these different perspectives. And but what struck me when I read the book is that it's actually about so much more than that. So, you know, it's like the topic of reproduction and the conspicuity of reproduction, but at the same time, it's about so much more than reproduction. And reproduction really serves as a lens through which we can learn about like other topics, which like many of which are actually not really well researched. And so that's also why I think that book is such an important contribution to various topics within anthropology. So like I've just sort of chosen a few of these topics which I found to be like particularly striking and important to me as a reader, and there are many more in it, but unfortunately I only have half an hour. I could probably go on much longer. So one of those, of course, is this like the focus on this like very, very unique group of people, and that's the so-called Wende generation. So these are the people who were like born in the last decade of divided Germany, and who experienced both worlds in a way. So as children experienced like Eastern and Western Germany, and then came of age during like the reunification, and then spent most of their lives in reunified Germany. And that is like a very unique group of people, because neither those who are older nor those who are younger actually have, you know, sort of have partaken in life in Germany in this way. And of course, Berlin plays a particularly important role there, because Berlin as a place that is both Eastern and Western Germany, and where these two paths sort of, you know, bleed into one another, that makes Berlin a very special place in that respect. What is also important if we look at reproduction, of course, is that for these people, like the beginning of their sort of reproductive phase is actually was around the Wende times or reunification or shortly after. So for these people, this very significant event during their lives is actually sort of comes together with this moment when a lot of people start thinking about reproduction, whether they want to do it or not, but where it sort of becomes somehow present. And in that respect, this is a very unique and very interesting generation, especially in relation to reproduction. And I actually found the work by Sarah Franklin and Marsha Inhorn like useful in order to look at this, because they've introduced this term of reproductive histories, where they look at how different countries, or how in different countries reproduction is like develops, and reproductive technologies and approaches to reproduction develop in different ways, linked to specific historical events. And if you look at this particular generation, Meghana is looking at in this book, of course, like the Wende, like German reunification was such like a huge event and had such an impact on people's lives, that of course also had like a very strong effect on how people think and experience and perform reproduction in a way. And that also has an impact on how, or that is sort of linked to how in Germany like reproduction is choreographed, or how it's and reproductive regimes. And what makes Berlin so interesting is, on the one hand, the fact that it's both East and West Germany, and also that it's a very small geographic area compared to many other places in Germany, because of course there are also places which, you know, were at the border, but to have this like very tiny geographic space where these things come together, and also like a place which has like a very interesting history for like West Germany, or like the West Berlin part, was somehow some kind of a melting pot where people would go, for example, who didn't want the military. Like it had this like very cheap to live. So there were lots of artists and students and so on. And so this is like a place which already had like this very specific atmosphere. I think you also mentioned this like idea of atmosphere in the book quite a bit, which makes it so specific, but at the same time, it's really like, you know, it can serve as a very good example for broader developments within the country. Maybe, you know, later, but it's very useful to take this as like an example. So to me, when I read the book, as I said, it's about reproduction, yes, but it's also very much a book about Germany as a formerly divided country and now a reunified country, and how Germany as a nation understands a belonging and the role of its citizens and of people who belong and who don't, and especially as a country who like that identifies belonging very much through blood and much less through territory, which is also something which you can find in the ways citizenship is organized or like regulated by law. That is something that very much links to this idea of, you know, how does a nation reproduce itself, or like how does a nation want its citizens to reproduce? And when I read the book, throughout the book, I kept thinking about this claim or the sentence "Kinder statt Inder," and I was then delighted to see it at the end of the book. So for those who haven't heard this before, so Kinder statt Inder was like a quote from like a conservative made by a conservative politician in 2000. When then Chancellor Gerhard Schröder suggested it should be made easier for foreigners to come to Germany and get like work permits. And he used the example of Indian IT workers or Indian IT professionals that they wanted to attract to Germany as a country. And then this conservative politician, he said like children instead of Indians. That was his main claim, and which was the idea what we need in order to, you know, thrive as a nation is not Indian professionals, but we want to reproduce the nation, and the kinds of citizens that we want are children instead. And of course, that's like really illustrative of the way that Germany thinks about citizenship and belonging, and the kind of population the country wants to have. And it, to use another German term, it really gave me some Schadenfreude. I don't like this malicious joy that in the end it is like, or now it is like a scholar from India sort of dissecting these kinds of things happening in Berlin. It actually made me very happy, and also like I chuckled a little bit from time to time because it's sort of because it is somehow a very, very fun response to this horrible statement. Yeah, it's sort of that book really through this lens of reproduction, like tells us quite, or shines a light also on these like pronatalist reproductive regimes. And it also shows, and that was something that incredibly interesting, how like other, like sort of the longer term history and like Nazi times, how that echoes and reverberates, you know, in these kinds of ideas about citizenship and belonging and being German and reproducing the nation, how that keeps reverberating in like today's, you know, and in today's like perception of reproduction and in today's reproductive regimes. And on the one hand, like it's like really like well shown in the book, a lot of the people who, like a lot of these interlocutors and a lot of the people who book actually to try to work against this like Nazi ideology, they try to be different, and they try to be different parents, and that was also that kind of ideology they want to get away from. But at the same time, in Germany's reproductive regime, again, like this idea of the nation sort of comes up again and again and again. So that is something that, as I feel about it, that is also something this book is about, in a yes, and then there's these other aspects that I also found really really important, and that is like how this like vendor generation, how they like very creatively used like free spaces, and how they would squat houses, and how they would actually also perform kinds of like care and relatedness that differ from exactly these like traditional like German ways of or ideas of kinship and biological relatedness, and thereby like challenging these like very common ideas within Germany more broadly. And that is like where Berlin had always had like a very different role, or like was very different from the rest of Germany. And for me, that is of course also something that that I find that sort of really resonated with me, because I actually moved to Berlin in '96 as a student. So like a lot of the things that are mentioned in this book are things that I experienced myself. So it was in a way also reading about my own story, about my own life. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So yeah, just in general, sort of like these topics like are all included in this book, even though they're not specifically claimed, but they sort of, you know, they're part of this part of the whole narrative and part of the story. And so I just found this incredibly sharp-witted and detailed, and what I wrote here, it's like almost uncannily accurate, because like so many of the quotes, like I just like I kept thinking like, yes, this is how it was, and this is how it is, and this is how I felt, and this is how I feel now. And so many of these things came up. And that is, of course, something that I haven't experienced before in this particular way. And this is like, you know, I just loved reading the book. I felt like it's a little bit like engaging also with my own story in the city. And also like the houses that are mentioned, like the squatted houses. And I do remember like the rundown buildings, and the communal like renovation activities, and the ways like kinship and relatedness were sort of discussed and thought about, and political discussions going on. And like all of that like is so well captured in this book, and how that keeps playing a role in people's lives today. And like this particular generation, like where like a very high percentage among them have actually chosen not to have children, and who keep living like lives which are quite different from the lives of many other people in other parts of Germany. And like that, of course, brings me back to the real topic of the book, and that's like this like very weird role reproduction played and continues to play in this very specific setting. So like when I moved to Berlin in the mid-90s, like children were not particularly visible or invisible. They were just sort of like, you know, like running along or coming along the current in a way. And then I think this book shows really well how that somehow changed over the years, and how these like two motives of like being particularly child unfriendly, and at the same time also being particularly child friendly, how these two aspects materialized in a way. And at the same time, this like two-sidedness of reproduction, this extreme visibility versus the extreme invisibility of others, like these different sort of these binary oppositions in the way that became stronger and stronger over the years. I think that the book captures this really, really well. And again, I think that that's another reason why this like concept of conspicuity is like a wonderful approach to describe this like complexity and these like different aspects of reproduction in Berlin. And sort of looking at the different chapters and like these like specific like the like motives that are mentioned in the book, what I really liked and what I felt that was something that I could read to is like the materiality of conspicuous reproduction. And of course, like Meghana has just talked about the strollers, and it is funny because like this the materiality of the strollers, it somehow has like you know it opens up the place for, or it opens up a space for so many different topics of discussion. And I thought that this materiality was something that that was extremely helpful to sort of capture different issues that she's talking about. So on the one hand, like the stroller as like a symbol for the conspicuity of reproduction, and as something that represents and disturbs, it also enables and it hinders and it sort of disrupts in various ways. And what I really like is like this complexity and like the different role that's played by this like artifact in a way. And on the one hand, it's an artifact that's incredibly costly. It symbolizes belonging to a certain group of people. It may also block corridors and sidewalks and corners and cafes or spaces in the bus. And in doing so, it reserves these spaces for those who have reproduced, like, or for those who take care of children, and takes these spaces. And I think the book shows that really well, how these, in a way, they symbolize this taking away of these spaces from others who have not partaken in reproduction. And it also again makes reproduction like hyper visible, like in sort of not in really sort of occupying space in various ways. But at the same time, like the stroller also has like this potential to enable, for example, mobility for parents who, you know, can get around in the city more, but it can also disable them. And that's what I liked about the example of one young mother who said, I feel this weight of the stroller. And I could really relate to that. This, as somebody who also reproduced at some point in the city, this like where you describe how people just, you know, won't help you when you're at the steps to the U-Bahn, or, you know, you're there and it just like it's bulky, it just really hinders, it's such a weight, and suddenly you are only seen as a person, as with a child and as a mother, and you sort of lose your identity as a person through this stroller. And I think that was captured really well in the book. And then there's this other aspect of the materiality, and that is the burning strollers. And when I read this in the book, I looked it up again, because I somehow had this feeling that I had read in the news again and again and again that this continues to be a problem. And it does. Like this, like burning strollers in Berlin are like a huge problem. And we actually had like in the last couple of, maybe like in the last decade or so, there have actually several people who died because of this. Because like when strollers were burnt and then a big fire broke out, then several families have actually died because of arson when strollers were put on fire. So there's also this kind of materiality that really sort of, you know, that makes these strollers such a good example for sort of illustrating these kinds of issues in a city like Berlin, and this like disabling also as something that really like that becomes the subject of so much aggression and violence. And then the other materiality that I found also really, really important to think about is these obstacles that were put in front of cafes so that strollers can't get in anymore. And there was this huge discussion in German media at the time, or especially in Berlin media. And when I read it in this book, it suddenly reminded me of like a completely unrelated but at the same time also related kind of research that's been done on Berlin, and that's Bruno Latour's work on the Berlin Key. I don't know if any one of you know that piece. And there's this very And this is a key that only exists in Berlin. And this is like a key that has like the, what's it called? Like the shard or something, like the pieces that go in and then you turn on both sides. And the key sort of, the key has to be inserted on one side of the door, and it needs to be taken out on the other side. So you cannot put it in, open the door, and then take it out. So you have to lock the door again. And this key was designed in order for people to make people lock the door again when they either go into the house or they go out. And why am I mentioning this? This is, of course, it somehow sounds a little bit far-fetched, but what I really, what it reminded me of is really this, like this obstacle put in front of the cafe, which really makes you act in a certain way and allows certain kinds of actions, and it doesn't, and it doesn't others. And then what Latour writes about this Berlin key, and I think that is something that can be very well sort of also used for this obstacle in front of the cafe, is that he says, from being a simple tool, the steel key assumes all the dignity of a mediator, a social actor, an agent, an active being. And that is exactly what that obstacle did. And it also had this like really, there was this major symbolism involved in this obstacle, which like there was like an uproar in Berlin. It just like people freaked out, and it was like people would talk on the street, and it was like a huge topic of discussion. The fact that this that there were these obstacles put in front of cafes, and would exclude people with children from entering. And the funny thing is that a lot of parents were actually really happy, because finally there were places they could go where there were no children, and they could just like have a coffee in peace. So this was also something that that this whole discussion about hindering or sort of this child unfriendliness actually wasn't even really what parents felt at the time. So, these are all of these things are like such good examples for how reproduction is really negotiated also around these objects like that obstacle, and how these objects again in themselves, gain some kind of agency almost, and these like regarding these obstacles in front of the cafe, it was also something that in these newspaper reports, it almost became like an offense to the reproduction of the nation. And that is what makes the materiality also like an interesting idea to sort of think about, like with regard to reproduction. And then there was another thing that also somehow I caught myself in all my, and my prejudices and everything, and that's a Swabian mother. Like when I read like the description of this like stereotype, like these women who come from Swabia and who are like very clean, and they're very punctual, and they're very wealthy, and they buy all the flats, and they want to make Berlin into like Swabia. That is something that I have to admit, I caught myself also using these stereotypes quite regularly. So it's a bit of a hobby to rant about these mothers. And I mean, the interesting thing is that I actually do know quite a few Swabian mothers, and what many of them do is that they try to hide the fact that they're Swabian mothers. So they try to hide their accent. They don't tell anybody where they're coming from. They try to not be Swabian by sort of not coming on time and being untidy and celebrating the untidiness and stuff. And what is interesting about it is that that all of these are actually things that, like in other parts of Germany and also beyond, are like very valued qualities, like punctuality and cleanliness and like very diligent and all these kinds of things. And that again, I think this idea of a Swabian mother and this whole stereotype is also something that that is very illustrative of the very uniqueness of reproduction in Berlin, and that also makes it like very special in this context. And then finally, like another topic that I think is also like that is a very, very important contribution to anthropology of Germany and in Germany is this is the focus also on like male infertility, because that is also something that in general, I think in the anthropology of reproduction, male infertility hasn't really received very much attention. It has a little bit more in the last couple of years, but it's not like it's not one of the very central topics of study. And I think this whole idea of like gender and reproduction, looking at that with a focus on men, is something where like there's still much research to be done. So I think that the book also makes like a very important contribution to the study of male infertility, and in relation to gender roles and gender stereotypes, of course, and especially again in the German context, where still these like certain like long-term ideas about gender and fathers, as is discussed in the book, still play like a very important role. So just to sort of come a little bit more to like what the contributions are of this book, like what can be learned from the book. So what are the important points the book makes? And I think that like one of the real strengths of the book is that it shows the complexity of reproduction, and it really it's really successful in not simplifying, which especially regarding these kinds of questions happens very quickly. And it would have been really easy to do it, to just look at it in this like two sides of the coin way, but that's what the book doesn't do. And I think the book is really successful in showing us like the complexity and the frictions and the dilemmas, and also the many meanings that that reproduction can take. And then on the one hand, this is an important contribution to the study of reproduction in general within anthropology. But it's also like a very important contribution to the ways in which, like in different cultural contexts and in different social and national contexts, reproduction is negotiated and is regulated and is performed, and reproductive regimes, how they are embedded into certain cultural contexts. And I think especially like the study of reproduction in Germany hasn't received very much attention, and especially not from scholars outside of Germany. So there's like very, very few scholars who are not German who've studied reproduction in Germany. There's like a real lack of literature. So I think that this is also a very important contribution to that body of literature, also in comparison to studies in other countries. And finally, what I think in times when there's a lot of talk about decolonizing anthropology, and if we really look at the studies that are being done, this is much more a buzzword than really being decolonial. And what I just enjoyed so much is to actually have this like look on Germany and on almost my own story, and being the researched and not the researcher, from somebody who comes from South Asia, from a country and from a place where usually people from Germany go there. And it's a very classical research field to go to India and also to study reproduction and to study all these kinds of issues that are discussed in this book. But to my knowledge, this really is the first book where somebody from South Asia comes to Germany and looks, reverses the gaze, as Meghana called it in the book. And I think that is like an incredibly important contribution. And to me, it was so enjoyable to actually read this from the perspective of course, from the perspective as the anthropologist, and also as an anthropologist who focuses on reproduction. But also from the perspective of the research, because to me, it really in so many respects felt it was like I could have been one of these interlocutors as somebody who comes from West Germany, who moved to Berlin, who lived in this like post reunification Berlin, and then who at some point also had a child in Berlin, and I just like live about half a minute from Görlitzer Park, which is also featured in one of the chapters. So I'm almost looking at Görlitzer Park. So to me, this was almost reading a book about myself as a member of the Wende generation, but also through the anthropological lens. So I think for me, this has been such an enjoyable and important read, and I just hope that many more people, especially those who live in Berlin, read it and see sort of and are able to sort of learn about themselves through this lens. And then finally, yes, I just hope like my sort of like 2-3 questions I would have would be like, well, first of all, I think it would perhaps even be interesting to develop that idea of conspicuous reproduction even further to make it to really make it into some kind of conceptual tool, because I think it's extremely helpful for looking at reproduction. I'm pretty sure that it will be helpful in all other contexts too. So that would be one thing, to really develop this as like strictly theoretical, to make it useful also for other research contexts. And the other and a question I do have is, because this, and I mean, this is sort of the focus of the book, so this is not a criticism, but more like a question I have is like whether you also have some like material on people who are not sort of like, who do not identify as German, or who have a background in other countries, or who do not identify as German for other reasons. I mean, we have a huge Turkish population in Berlin, for example, but who many of whom have German passports and who've lived here for generations. Like how this differs. And I'm pretty sure it does. And as far as I understand, it really does. And then like the way, their reproduction is conspicuous. And then, of course, also like all sorts of like queer identities, like some kind of more sort of intersectional approach. And I know that was not what the book was supposed to do, but I was wondering if that would be something that you could, or whether you have material that you would that could sort of add to that, sort of like a top up or like a plus or something. And I would love to maybe read a bit more about that, and I don't know, an article or talk about it or something. And yes, as I said, I could keep talking about this for a very long time, but I don't want to I don't want to take up all the time. I just really want to thank you for this wonderful book. I enjoyed reading it so much, and I enjoyed the ethnographic detail, and you got it all right. Like I always was like, oh yes, this is what it's like. This is what it's like to have a bicycle accident in Berlin. This is what it's like to feel like after like 8 months of winter, and suddenly everybody's out on the street and sitting in the cafe. And all these really like these small ethnographic details were just so that like uncannily accurate. And I think you've just done an amazing job. I really love the book. So congratulations.
Thank you so much, Annika. That's wonderful. So Meghana, if you want to respond, maybe you can do the stop the screen share, and if you would like to respond, that would be great, and then we can open it up for Q&A. I'm sure there's lots of questions. So
thank you. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Annika, thank you so much. It's you've just been utterly generous. Thank you. I can respond maybe first to this last question that you asked me, and then perhaps say something else regarding some of your other comments if there are questions that are in that direction. So when I was doing this research, I would say that my interest was primarily, quote unquote, ethnic Germans. And by that, what I mean is people who had generationally some kind of connection to this historical context. And you referred to the work of Inhorn and Franklin, and you talked about reproductive histories. What I was thinking about was, what would it mean for somebody whose parents or grandparents were post-war children or parents post-war and had their children in Germany, were influenced by those historical climates and contexts, and what that meant for parenting, or what that meant for having children or not having children, what it meant to live in divided Germany, and specifically Berlin, and how that influenced their reproductive trajectory. So there was this desire to think about a very particular German historical context or generational context, and understand the German-German relations in the city. I was, of course, surprised by this. I had not conceptualized the vendor generation as being the focus of my research, but they became the focus of my research primarily also because of these reproductive histories, or because of this historical context. What is interesting is that in my conclusion chapter, I do say something about what it means to have people who are identified very clearly as, people, as they say in the, statistically, they are put in this category of people with migration background, right? No longer Ausländer, now they're called people with migration background. So what it means to have people who have different forms of parenting, or have different histories, or have different generational experiences to interact with Germans, and what kind of changes, or what kind of impact, what kind of resentments that would cause. So that's a question. I certainly take that as something that one can think about in terms of maybe writing an article. There's one last thing that I'll say about this, is that what I did find very interesting was that I had a lot of Berliners say to me, especially the fathers groups, for instance, they would say something like, have you noticed how the Turkish fathers are with their children, right? They're different. They touch them more often, they hold them more often. Or I would have fathers say to me, you play very differently with our children. We don't see other people play like them in this manner. So what was interesting is these commentaries on specific practices of care or interaction between parents that were being compared and contrasted. At the same time, I had people say, oh, these bare feet playgrounds are never going to work, because look, those Turkish families are here, they're grilling in next to us in Görlitzer Park, and they always come with 7 children, right? Because they have 7 of them. So there was this very complex sort of commentary. And the simple answer to your question is that no, in my work, at least for this book, I did not necessarily have interlocutors who would not, identify as German. And I take that comment, and it would be something to think about going forward, and also to see in what ways is the reproductive landscape changing, or are there ways in which there is this exchange of parenting practices and ways of being a parent, which again then starts to tell us something about what is considered as good parenting, what is considered as bad, who is doing it properly, who's not doing it properly. So I also one last comment about this was, I did have one lady say to me that the Arab families, they were termed as the Arab families, they let their children grow like wild roses. So I had these kind of commentaries a lot, the positive as well as the negative. So yes, something to think about.
Wonderful. Before we switch to Q&A, let's just do a round of applause at this point, because I think it's really, really remarkable presentations. And because I can't see everybody on the screen at once, because there's so many of you, which is wonderful as well, if you could just put in the chat either your question or that you want to ask a question. But as the host, I'm going to take my prerogative and ask the first question. And I just love the ethnographic detail, and I'm going to be thinking about burning strollers for a while after this talk. But I had a little bit more of a historical question, which has to do with daycare. And I'm thinking about the former East Germany and the ways in which the sort of norms around working mothers were very different. And the state subsidized daycare, strongly state paid for daycare, and that there wasn't the same sort of normative values around working mothers as opposed to West Germany. So what happens with daycare in the context that you're talking about?
Yes. Thank you. That's a wonderful question. And that actually brings me to the to what Annika mentioned again about why Berlin is very particular, and it became a lens through which I could understand so many other things. So when one of the things that are clearly different is the West German policies as far as family, supporting family work, etc., versus the East German. And when Germany was reunified, there was a drastic fall in fertility rates in East Germany. Also, one of the there's this term called family gentrification. So scholars have talked about how particular there's been this reversal of movement from families going into suburbia and settling there and having children to back to the cities. And this has been observed in places like Amsterdam, London, New York, and also Berlin in the last couple of years. So the one of the reasons why these Swabian mothers, the Southwest German states, a lot of women from West Germany, they moved to Berlin, or that was the motivation, was that this would be a place that would offer us more childcare options, because we still continue to have half-day schools, because the expectation is that the model of marriage is this Hausfrau Ehe, where the woman stays at home and the husband has the full-time employment. Even the taxation policies are geared towards that, where you benefit the most if one of the partners has full-time employment versus the others. So definitely the debate during the time I was doing fieldwork, some of it continues even now when I went back, was when are we going to have full-time schools? Of course, those are increasing in number. We should have these daycares in place. People should have a right to daycare, which was declared as a right to public daycare in 2013. Of course, the debate is, do we have enough money? Do we have enough daycares in place to take care of all these children? So these debates became all the more vocalized, or they were being heard all the time, especially in the years since reunification, when these West German families were also moving into Berlin to have children, or to settle, to make their families there, or however you want to call it. So daycare is a big issue in terms of there's all the time you'll come across newspaper articles about there being a shortage of daycare, even though the number of children being born apparently is not enough. So that continues to be an issue.
Fascinating. Thank you. More questions people have? You can put
If I maybe just add what.
Yeah, go ahead, Annika. Yeah.
So, and I think one really important thing about daycare is also that, like in Germany, daycare is regulated like state by state, with the different states in Germany. And I think Berlin is one of the few, or maybe the only one, where daycare is free. And that, of course, makes a huge difference, because like in the south of Germany, for example, daycare can easily cost like 800 or 1,000 euros a month. And that's a huge chunk of people's income, whereas in Berlin, it's free. Like in Berlin, you only pay 23 euros for food for an entire month. So, of course, that makes Berlin incredibly attractive. And also that, like in many other places in Germany, daycare, as Meghana just said, finishes at like 12 or 1 o'clock, and in Berlin, it's till 4. So this is also something that's, of course, incredibly attractive. Yeah.
So we do have some questions. Nada, do you want to start?
Hello. Hi, Meghana. Congratulations. So I mean, just to echo the comments, right? Like I think it's been very interesting for me having just moved to Berlin 4 months ago. And your book has kind of reading your book also while moving here is almost like a Berlin guide for me, especially that like I'm not sorry, not Berlin, but it's like learning to right, like understanding the city through your book and also through my own like experiences, especially that I do live in Prince Lauerberg, which also very interestingly, I like, we've known each other so many years, but then I didn't realize Prince Lauerberg, which is where I live, actually where it's the main kind of site of the book, right? The Kinder Island or the Kinder, whatever, the children's island, and like the playground is right next to the house. The Kinder cafes are everywhere, and I didn't really know what these were until like I read the book and understood the context, and like it's been very interesting at this kind of like especially for an outsider like me in this specific moment in Egypt and in Germany, the tense and the anxiety around a lot happening at the moment internationally, but also as someone who looks like a clear outsider, me and my partner who live in the neighborhood, and sometimes, speak Arabic aloud. So it's very clear, that we are, where we might be from. And I think the question, so like, this is generally right, is just to kind of like echo how it's been, like the kind of relevance of the book and how strong the interventions that you make are. But I think the question that I had that I think you were very like, briefly mentioned, but is like, I think one of the main interventions of your book is this idea of like, engaging with reproductive regimes, but it's also interesting that it's not just men or women, right? Thinking about like masculine reproductive, or like how do men and women, but it's also like think about all these other, how different social groups within Germany, within even a certain neighborhood, right? Within even a building, relate to this reproductivity and anxieties around it, imaginations, comforts, discomforts, right? So like if you could elaborate more on this would be great. And congratulations again.
Thanks, Nada. Yeah, I just wanted to I wanted to say that I was inspired by scholars who write that we have spent a lot of time looking at reproduction mainly as an event that happens in a woman's body. So, studying pregnancy, studying miscarriage, studying, I don't know, breastfeeding, and that it's important that we think about reproduction not as an event, but as this process that is both biological and social. And also what this enables us to do is to look at reproduction across these events, across a life course. And it enables us to include men, for instance, and compare seemingly unrelated ideas or experiences. So just to give maybe one example, because I didn't speak about it too much in my presentation, although Annika mentioned this, one of the ways in which you can compare across, let's say, intensive motherhood or intensive parenting and artificial reproductive technologies that are involved in infertility treatments, right? Usually you won't bring these together, but this theoretical sort of focus on looking at reproduction as process enables us to do that. And what I learned by making comparisons across these two groups is that in sort of both places, there's an extreme pressure, extreme stress. The cultural script demands that you do everything possible to be either the perfect parent or to become a parent. And there's this desire to parent, which is naturalized, right? So by comparing these two groups, you understand this about reproduction. Also, you understand the gendered aspect of reproduction, how in both these groups, the focus is very often the woman, or the responsibility is on the woman's body. And I guess one more thing that becomes very clear when you compare across these groups is how reproduction is stratified in terms of, as I said, good parenting or proper parenting, but also in terms of whether a particular group has access to medical technologies for infertility treatment, or when you have international medical tourism, who are the people who are asked to be surrogate, and what is the politics of medical tourism, and who is able to access these services and who's not. So when you do this kind of comparison across groups, it allows for a more nuanced, I think, understanding of the concept instead of perhaps looking at just an event. And hence my interest in looking at all these different groups.
Wonderful. Thank you. Tanner Ritz has a question. Tanner?
Hi, yes, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Awesome, okay. Yeah, I have a question for both the speakers. So I'm one of Dr. Joshi's students in America. And just in my experience in American culture, I feel like it's very deviant for us to not have children or to desire to not have children. And just listening to the presentation, this is sort of different in a German context. Is it sort of more normalized to be single or childless? And I guess how does that affect the topics of the book?
Annika, he's addressed it to both of us. I don't know if you want to go first.
I don't mind.
Go ahead.
I can go first if you like. So no, I would also say that like still the choosing not to reproduce, I would say is still something that's suspicious somehow. There's something wrong with you in a way, and especially and I think that it has a very, very important gendered element, like as a man not to reproduce, or as a cis man not to reproduce, is something that is sort of okay because you still have time, but like it's very common also to be asked by complete strangers, like, oh, okay, when are you gonna have kids? If you are, seen or like appear to be a woman, or read as a woman, then that is, I would say that is still a very common thing. So I would say that choosing not to have children is, yeah, it's somehow still seen as something suspicious and weird. At the same time, if people who are not supposed to reproduce, for example, queer people, or also people who are seen to be like, who are dependent on state support, people with disabilities, people like, with all different sorts of characteristics that make them less desirable regarding reproduction. If these people want to reproduce, then that is also often stigmatized. So, for example, I also work with a lot of queer people who choose to use assisted reproductive technologies to become parents, and that is also something that's extremely criticized. So, like the way I see it is that it is like there's this very strong idea of the normal, and the normal is heteronormative. Very, very strongly heteronormative. But I don't know. What do you think, Megan?
I think I would agree with you. At the same time, there's also somewhere, definitely at the time of doing fieldwork, I really came from, I mean, I was embedded in what the cultural script in India was, because I had barely lived in the US at that time. And one of the interesting contrasts for me, because of my work in India and then sort of doing this comparative contrast kind of work in Germany, was the difference in the way in which perhaps this whole debate about choice was contemplated, and the fact that you can contemplate, the fact that you can think about whether or not you have a child, was something that certainly was more, I would say, more present, comparatively speaking, in Germany versus in India. But yes, I agree with you, which is why I also use the term selective pronatalism, because there is definitely, clearly the idea that the desired way to reproduce is in specific normative family structures, even as There are, the voices of people who don't fall into those traditional or those normative structures. Maybe they're getting louder in some cases, but yeah.
Interesting.
Mm.
Susan, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah. Meghana, as you know, I love your book. And I guess my question has to do with feminism and gender resentments. And I'm just wondering if there are debates about feminism or if there are gender resentments either across gender or within, like among women that are being sort of played out through the larger public debate around children. There's just so much going on, in terms of nationhood, gender, generation.
So one of my probably chapters probably addresses what you are asking to some extent. The one where I talk about these women who are not married and who do not have children and their experiences, and a lot of them speak about growing up in a time in Germany where a lot of what their mothers or women before them had done was fought for rights, had tried to educate them in what a feminist ideologies were and how they could live those out. And a lot of these women really spoke about how difficult it was for them to be able to maybe live life with those ideologies, practice it in that manner, assume or expect those kind of relationships, and the fact that the same kind of work had not been done with men. And there was a lot of resentment because of that, and an inability somehow to well, inability is the wrong word, but one of the ways in which they talked about, and I make this clear that we are not talking about childlessness or child-freeness or whatever you want to call it as choice or not choice. It's really very complicated, and one of the things that made it complicated was these constant clashes or inability to make their ideologies of what a partnership should look like work along with the men in their lives. And that was where I found that a lot of women really were disappointed or were not able to fulfill their expectations of what it meant to partner. And I don't know if I have answered your question, but that I felt that came out the most strongly in terms of resentments and ideologies related to what should a family look like, or what should partnership look like, or what should a relationship look like? What does that mean in terms of having or not having children? That's where it was most vocally sort of expressed in the narratives of these unmarried women without children.
I think we have time for just one more question we can slip in here. So Marshall, do you want to go ahead and then we can end it up?
Yeah, thank you, Meghana. I'm curious the instance of the violence and the burning of the strollers and everything. Is there any cases of retaliatory violence or posturing on the side of parents of hanging pepper spray on the edge of their strollers, or I'm thinking like decking out their strollers in like Mad Max type stuff, but just in terms of like a defensive posture to that.
Yes.
Is it any of that?
Some of it I recall. So maybe Annika can tell me some more if I have missed them. So for instance, there were women who started these blogs where they would talk about this kinderunfreundlich, child unfriendly atmosphere, and they would present their stories, really pose their stories as a response to what was happening. That was one, which probably was not, it's not the same as, going and burning strollers and then having that retaliation. But there were also women who would talk about how for them, it was very important to actually, just as much as not be recognized as a Southwest or West German woman, be recognized as as a woman from West Germany and own that and enjoy all the privileges that come with it. So yes, it's wonderful that I can step out and I can go right there onto that playground, and my child's dentist is just around the corner. So there were these utterances, and there were these maybe some online, some kind of, obviously, this kind of performance that was possible. Then one last thing that I do remember is that there was so because I didn't mention this, let me just set it up a little bit. One of my chapters talks about how particularly the target of resentment became these Schwabian mothers, or the women. Schwabia refers to a region in Southwest Germany, and how these women after reunification moved to Berlin to, because it was cheaper, because of many other reasons, and eventually became the ones who would be identified with family gentrification, because they bought these houses. Before reunification, most houses were publicly owned. And then after that, slowly everything was, sold off and the prices started to rise, the usual story. And these people who moved from Southwest Germany, and of course, they're not just from Southwest Germany, they're from all over Europe also, but because there were these regional differences between the Schwabians, who are supposed to be clean and thrifty and disciplined, and Berliners who are dirty and poor and, don't know how to live. There was always these clashes. There was lots of protests about bakeries that sold bread where the local name of the bread was from Southwest Germany instead from Berlin. What these people started doing very often as retaliation was something like this, where the bakeries would have names from Southwest Germany. And there's a particular dish called Käsespätzle, which I don't know how to prepare it, but I've eaten it many times. But there was somebody who threw a whole bunch of Käsespätzle at a statue in the center of one of these neighborhoods as a way to declare, we are here to stay, you better deal with us. Right? So there were some of these retaliations, as far as I remember, from my time in Berlin.
Annika, did you want to add anything to that before?
Well, just a tiny little anecdote actually from my own house, because like in my house, we have a childcare place downstairs. And what is actually happening really is, and that has been like a topic of discussion in my house, is that people drop off their children, and then they leave their strollers in the corridor of the house. So actually, like the people like us who live here, we cannot get through anymore with our bikes, which are in the backyard.
Yeah.
So this is just a tiny story, but this is also like where actually, some of us living here, even though we also have children, where we sort of feel like, people are really aggressive with their strollers in our house because they're too lazy to take it back home. So it continues to be like a constant, like, there's like that. It really is such a symbol, and there continues to be conflict about these kinds of like claiming space and encroaching on spaces and stuff. So it's not super aggressive. So I wouldn't say that people, attack others and say like, oh, let me through. But yeah, so there's a lot of there's a lot of discussion about these things. And as I said, like I really like how you showed these different perspectives in the book, because you really well illustrate like these different views and these different perspectives on these kinds of issues. And even I myself, like I have two hearts somehow beating in my breast, like, it's I see the, as somebody who has a child herself and as somebody who's really annoyed by the Scorpion mothers.
Yeah.
I know it's very un-PC as an anthropologist to say that, but sort of, this so I think it continues to be it continues to be a conflict around the strollers and the claiming of space.
I kind of want to just keep watching the stroller wars go on, and I'll need an update It was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for your great insights. This has been a terrific presentation. Thank you all for coming. So
Thank
let's give a final round of applause to our speakers today. And
Thank you
please
so
join
much.
us for look at the Gender Institute website. We've got a number of other events before the end of the semester. So thank you all. Enjoy your weekends.
Thanks, Annika, once again. Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you. Thank you very
Well,
much.
thank you so much
Annika.
for inviting me and, giving me the opportunity to read and comment on this wonderful book.
Wonderful.